This video is sponsored by WorldAnvil. Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and we finally wrapped up the Proving Grounds beta that focused on the first phase of the Siege rework for Total War Warhammer 3. For those that may have been living under a rock the last month or so, the Proving Ground beta was a exactly 2-week period that allowed Creative Assembly to introduce a few changes revolving around one big change to siege combat or siege maps in Total War. This big change, of course, being the removal of the long maligned pocket ladders, which allowed all infantry, the ladders themselves, to just casually walk up to almost any wall and immediately produce a ladder out of nowhere to climb said wall. And it was something that really sucked in a lot of people's opinion. So let's start there. The issue of the pocket ladders has been quite significant from their introduction back in the original Total War Warhammer. From the infamous Mandalore video noting just how jarring they are, to the immersion of the game, to those like myself that found the pocket ladders made defending the walls and gate of a settlement just nearly pointless in the vast majority of scenarios. When the attacker's best strategy is to just surround a settlement and swarm up the walls from every direction, it makes sieges into fairly mindless battles where the defender has to immediately surrender the walls instead of guarding them, which kind of defeats the point of a siege battle. So, how do I think their removal impacted the game? To put it bluntly, I found the removal of the pocket ladders to be a vast improvement to the experience of siege gameplay. In order to attack a walled settlement, the situation has changed from just rushing the walls with legions of infantry to including tools in an army to deal with the initial phase of walls and gates. If the player or AI just rushes into a siege without any proper units or abilities to deal with walls, they're forced into extreme choke points around the gates, which makes the situation far easier to contain as the defender. This makes the outnumbered defenders have an actual shot at holding out against enemies that both outnumber and outmatch them. I spent time during the Proving Grounds trying out nearly every faction in the game on legendary difficulty. And the one thing that consistently popped up for me was that going into a siege as a defender was so much better than it had been before the Proving Grounds beta. Although I'd still like to see garrisons overhauled in terms of the amount of units and which units are in them, I did find that defending felt actually possible, even with a relatively weak garrison against a good-sized attacking army, if the attacker didn't have proper tools to get past my walls. This, at least in my opinion, is a major positive to the experience of playing a campaign. It does slow you down a little bit if your goal is just to paint the map per se, but I think sieges should slow you down. They should be something that breaks up the monotony of doing constant land battles or auto-resolving your way through everything. Obviously, auto-resolve is something that's going to be looked at in the future. I'm not going to worry about that in this video. But I do think the change was a very good one for people that like immersive gameplay, like me. So, to summarize, I would rate the removal of pocket ladders to have been a net positive, at least for my play experience. It helps sieges by making the walls into an actual obstacle that needed to be overcome instead of just brute forced. However, it wasn't the only change introduced, so let's delve into the other major alteration we saw with ladders. To allow for players and the AI to still have good options, Creative Assembly introduced a prototype new piece of siege equipment that is functionally just a set of ladders. However, unlike the pocket ladders, these have to be constructed just like battering rams and siege towers. Plus, they have to be pushed by a singular unit up to a wall. This allows ladders to stay in the game but they require investment and can be countered either by being destroyed on the way to the wall or by defenders ensuring the part of the wall they attach to is properly defended. Plus, the ladders have been altered a bit, so units climbing them are overall slower to climb up in force, giving the defenders an even better chance to punish them through combat. This is an excellent change, and one that should be permanent, at least to me, as they offer a good alternative to siege towers with their own pros and cons. However, they do have two major issues that I think should be resolved. First off, the siege ladders are clearly made of a weaker, flimsier material than the armored siege towers, but currently are pretty difficult to destroy. They're seemingly just as resistant to small arms missile fire, which shouldn't be the case. Ladders should be fairly vulnerable to all forms of shooting, including bows and guns, etc., and blow up very easily when hit by artillery weapons or defensive towers. To make them actually viable when you're taking a bunch of them, which you can, it's really easy to just have a ton of them on the battlefield very quickly. The second issue actually has nothing to do with the ladders themselves per se, but with their relationship to siege towers. When preparing for a siege battle, the various pieces of siege equipment can be constructed over turns, with each piece being worth a certain amount of labor force. The ladders are worth less than siege towers, notably less, but my biggest complaint was that the ladders weren't cheap enough when compared to the siege towers. Most armies could afford, when attacking through a siege, to just immediately build either siege towers or ladders. They could afford both. And you get 2 per slot of both. So if you build ladders, you got 2 ladders, and if you build siege towers, you get 2 siege towers. So it kind of falls to the situation of why would you ever build ladders when most of the time you could just build siege towers unless you just wanted a ton of ladders. Personally, I'd really recommend changing it so that ladders are either almost hilariously cheap, or at the very least, siege towers are much more expensive. Perhaps we could even make it where siege towers, you only get 1 siege tower per build slot instead of 2 siege towers per build slot. That way, if your goal is to truly swarm the walls with infantry, then ladders are a better alternative when it comes to trying to get into that siege as quickly as possible from the campaign map. But siege towers, if maybe you only got 1, could be significantly tankier, far more resistant to shooting from the towers and artillery and what have you, but they're definitely going to make it, and they also, of course, don't impose the significant vigor penalty that your units take by climbing up ladders. Of course, the last little issue with ladders is that they are very generic looking at the moment, but the developers have told us that this is simply a placeholder version of what the actual ladder siege equipment would look like, and they have confirmed that the hope is to see faction specific designed ones in sometime in the future. So just like we have with our battering rams and our siege towers, where they have little pieces of iconic flair and art to identify them as belonging to whatever faction you're playing. Speaking of faction specific designs, one thing the Proving Grounds beta definitely inspired in my soul was the deep desire to see all the factions in the game receive their own unique flares and abilities for siege battles. There's something so thrilling about looking at the incredible diversity found among all of Warhammer's various factions and imagining how they tackle similar situations, like siege warfare. Coming up with all the lore accurate and yet manageable gimmicks that the factions could have is a pretty considerable task that requires just a lot of writing and organizing your thoughts, which is why it can be so pivotal and helpful to have a tool like WorldAnvil. WorldAnvil is the ultimate all-in-one software for tabletop gamers, fantasy novelists, and anyone who loves forms of creative world building. WorldAnvil is not just one tool, however, it's a world building suite, an RPG campaign manager, and a novel and publishing tool. It provides you with expert resources to create and organize your own thoughts and writing for whatever projects you may be working on. Perhaps searching through various Warhammer publications to formulate how the Lizardmen might uniquely approach siege battles. Organizing your thoughts, such as perhaps Chameleon Skink should be given something like a wall climber trait to sneak up walls without the need for equipment due to their innate climbing ability and specialization as stealthy infiltrators. Or perhaps organizing lists of the different creatures and features that deserve unique interactions in sieges, such as ethereal units being able to pass through walls or spider units climbing over them. Of course, even outside my obsessive ramblings about the potential of sieges, WorldAnvil is an incredible asset for anyone that needs a robust world-building tool to create rich, interactive experiences, allowing you to not only create, but share and collaborate with others. Now's a great opportunity to take advantage, as WorldAnvil has taken the initiative to support our community with a special offer. You can save 51% off a yearly subscription with code SOTEK at checkout. Once again, that's code SOTEK, SOTEK at checkout to save over half, 51% of your yearly subscription with WorldAnvil. Please check out the links in the description and pinned comment to support what I do here, in addition to beginning your journey on creating for your worlds, tabletop RPG games, and more. Thanks again to WorldAnvil for sponsoring this video. One of the best examples in the Proving Ground beta of how factions should feel, in my opinion, was actually the Skaven. For those that catch the live streams, you may have noticed I completed a full Lord Scroll campaign, which proved to be an interesting experience. The use of plentiful summons, the warp bomb, army ability, and useful spells while on defense, while warp grinders and solid artillery pieces while on offense, made playing both sides of a siege battle to be engaging and enjoyable. After messing around with various other races, I really do think the Skaven have one of the most balanced experiences when it comes to the overall gameplay of siege warfare. In that, I think they act as a good example of providing both offensive and defensive methods of engagement for a template. That being said, there are still some core issues with sieges that I noticed in the Proving Grounds that do need to be addressed. Let's just go through the list, and I'll suggest what I think would be the most reasonable fixes for each of them. First up, we have gates. They're still problematic on a few different issues. Small units like Chaos Warhounds or Rat Wolves can chew through them at alarming speed due to their ability to swarm quite a few models into attacking position because of how small they are, and the speed of set attacks. They'll usually punch through the doors nearly as fast or sometimes even faster than colossal monsters or artillery pounding away with cannon fire. This absolutely must be fixed, though there are two approaches to doing so, in my opinion. The first would be making gates completely immune to damage, unless the attacker has the siege attacker trait, which honestly should probably be changed to the gate breaker trait to better articulate what the function of the trait indicates. Units with it are capable of attacking gates and dealing damage to them, with there being a spectrum of units that can attack gates but aren't particularly great at it, up to units that are specialized in tearing through them at impressive speed. This would be a admittedly radical option and could potentially cause issues where if the attacker's gate breakers and battering rams are destroyed, they may find themselves utterly unable to get through any gates. Personally, I don't see this as a major issue. If you come unprepared for a siege and your ways in are torn apart, then you lost and gotta retreat at that point. If the AI can be taught to retreat and fall back from ambushes, which they do in the current game, I'm sure it could be taught to them to retreat from a siege if they had no viable way to get in because the player successfully destroys all of their siege attackers and equipment. The second and less extreme option would be providing gates with a unique form of damage resistance that makes unspecialized units hit them for barely any damage. So having an absurd amount of armor, for instance, or a ward save that's negated only by the Gatebreaker trait, similar to how physical resistance can be canceled out by magical attacks. I'd really love to hear in the comments down below which of these you think would be more immersive and or better for gameplay. Another noticeable issue with gates is that currently there's no good way to defend them for the defender. Attackers can functionally bunch up under the gatehouse without penalty, as there's very few ways to hit them in what should be a very dangerous position. I'd really love to see the gatehouses themselves receive an ability to dump boiling oil or some other kind of attack down onto attackers in the form of a decent AoE explosion that could deal damage, but on a moderate cooldown. Or at the very least, give units on top of the gatehouse the ability to shoot down via murder holes. That way they could pepper attackers as they try to push through the gates. Either way, the boiling oil or murder holes should require a defending unit to be in control and on top of the gatehouse, allowing the attacker to counter this strategy by either destroying the gatehouse with army abilities or artillery, taking the gatehouse with their own units that are surging up the walls by force, or just simply obliterating the defending units on the gatehouse with shooting, magic, or flying units. The last big issue with gates is the notorious gate bug, which does tend to be a confusing term as it often can refer to two separate issues. The first is that units told to invade through a gate that has been destroyed or conquered have had a bad habit of instead changing their movement orders and instead moving up a nearby set of ladders, which could be beyond infuriating. Though most people tend to use the term gate bug to refer to an issue where the gates just like to casually open when defending units get too close to them or an attacker is routing nearby. This can sometimes allow attackers to functionally sneak into the settlement without even meaning to, which causes all sorts of issues. The movement issue that I mentioned first has gotten considerably better thanks to the removal of the pocket ladders and the change to how units climb ladders, which now more easily allows players to stop a unit in the middle of climbing to instead go elsewhere. So you can interrupt them from climbing and move them back through a gate if needed. For the bigger issue of attackers slipping through because the gate just keeps opening on accident, there's been a very popular request in the community to introduce some sort of button or toggle by the controlling player of a gate that simply locks it, making it impossible to open unless it's shattered. I am very in support of this request, as it would genuinely be a major step forward towards solving that particular concern. The other issue that comes from attackers accidentally slipping in is that there's also an issue of attacking units routing when assaulting the walls or gate of a settlement, with the unit running deeper into the settlement before later rallying. This can have the infuriating result of a defeated attacker unit randomly deciding it will continue the fight far away from the battle, suddenly able to start capturing objective points when it shouldn't have been able to escape deeper within in the first place. My personal recommended solution for this would be tweaking the 5 capture points within each attacked settlement to have a large AoE effect that just prevents attackers from rallying. So if an attacking unit somehow does rout within a settlement, they cannot rally until the unit manages to move outside of the capture point's spheres of influence, meaning they either leave the settlement, usually. They could do this by giving that if a capture point is owned by a defender, maybe it gives something like -50 leadership to routing or fleeing enemies within radius. Or it could just be something as simple as it just says units cannot rally and it disables the rally mechanic while they are within a settlement. But this would mean that if the attacker claims these capture points, the capture points no longer would have that effect, and now attacking units in the vicinity would have the ability to rally, which would also give attacking units significantly more incentive to try and capture all of the in-capture points if it's proving to be a particularly nasty siege, because if they just ignore them and keep just trying to kill all the defenders, should they break in combat or from harassment or shooting or what have you, or they break because of terror especially, this would result in them basically just fleeing and being impossible to rally until they're outside of the settlement. So if you're the attacker, that could be very, very spooky, because it would just put you in a very vulnerable position. Whereas if you're the defender, it just adds, in my opinion, another good layer of giving players a reason to get all of those capture points, because it could allow them to more effectively control the flow of the battle. All right, anyway, that ends my somewhat absurd diatribe on gates. So let's get into map design. For those that may not have been aware, there were 3 altered maps that were included in the Proving Grounds beta to try out some different designs, mostly around like terrain and how the various pathways through the settlements look, and also introducing larger little spaces within these settlements so that you could more effectively bunch up your units to do an organized defense if you wanted. These were the Skaven Hell Pit map, the Greenskins Black Fortress map, which should be called Black Crag, and it makes me really annoyed that it's not called Black Crag, but for some damn reason in the game it's coded as Black Fortress. And then Empire's, I want to say Altdorf, I think? Anyway, I played on the new Hell Pit map a ton due to the Lord Scroll campaign that I did. And I have to say that I loved the changes to this map. It wasn't perfect, but I'd really encourage continuing development in this direction. The biggest thing that jumped out at me was how vertical the map was, which really allowed my ranged units and artillery as the defender to fire down on attackers that were trying to assault other parts of my walls. The higher up sections, which were more in the center of the map, were safer for the attacker to assault because they were the highest up vertically, but they were also the most narrow sections, meaning that it was easier for the defender to hold back the attacker with less units because it was more of a choke point. Whereas the lower sections of the city had wall sections and multiple gates, so they were much, much wider, which made it very considerably easier to swarm with lots of attacking units and made defending like singular choke points basically impossible. However, because they were lower, they were exposed to the high elevation units, which allowed long range shooting units and artillery to have a much easier time firing down on top of them. I think this is a great start to tweaking the maps, so keep it up, CA. Though, that reminds me, one thing that I'd really like to see on siege maps is for the defenders to have their deployment zones extended just a little bit beyond their gates. If I have cavalry units or want to launch an early sortie with my units to sort of harass the attackers, it'd be really nice to have the option to deploy units just outside of my gates, especially if they have vanguard deployment, so that they can immediately set out to attack the enemy rather than me having to deploy all of them right behind the gate and then file out, which ends up usually being a huge mess. It's not something I need, but it'd be very nice to have. That actually reminds me of one other quick point, but brief, which is that currently there is a very unfortunate asymmetry in the game when it comes to weapon teams units. Grand Cathay is able to place their crane gunners on walls to shoot at approaching enemies. But I've noticed that Skaven and Vampire Coast can't. So Warplock Jezzails, Warp Fire Throwers, Poison Wind Mortars, and Rattling Gunners for the Skaven cannot deploy on walls or climb them. And the Deck Gunners for the Vampire Coast also cannot climb walls or deploy on them. Please, CA, fix this inconsistency. I know Grand Cathay is cool, but they shouldn't be allowed to be the only guys putting weapon teams on walls. The second to last thing I'll be talking about are the changes to the actual siege equipment and defensive wall towers. Battering rams were vastly improved in the Proving Grounds beta, moving a good bit quicker while still punching through gates at high speed. I do feel they should be more vulnerable to damage from ranged units, or even better, could we make it where it's possible for melee units to attack them? As currently, there's just not really any effective methods available for the defender to destroy them. Siege towers are still fine. I don't have any huge issues there. I would like to see maybe that artillery units could deal a significant amount of bonus damage against siege towers though. So if the defenders happen to have siege equipment, they can deal significant damage to things like towers, ladders, and battering rams, should they land hits. So maybe give artillery like a significant bonus to dealing damage against siege equipment, like plus 200, 300%. That way they can, if they're landing those attacks, because it's not easy to hit those pieces of equipment with most siege weapons, it can devastate them. Speaking of wall towers, they were pretty overly nerfed in the Proving Grounds beta, at least in my opinion. While I do agree that their previously near infinite range was far too much, in the beta, I think the range is too short. Long-range artillery such as cannons and catapults should be able to strike them safely from a distance, but shorter-range artillery like bolt throwers shouldn't. So I'd say that the defensive wall towers should have a range between those two, just a bit longer than the longest range bolt throwers and medium range artillery pieces. Also, I think their accuracy should be further improved just a little bit. Them having a shorter range is fine, but they should be dealing reliably good damage to approaching targets and able to land those shots in order to compensate for the fact that if the enemy has the appropriate tools, they can literally just sit back out of their range and blow them up. Finally, we need to discuss the AI. While it was better in most cases, there were a few glaring issues in the Proving Grounds beta. The biggest one I noticed over and over and over again was that the AI seemed almost incapable of deploying on the walls when defending. So they wouldn't utilize shooting down and approaching attackers with their ranged units, or even activating their defensive wall towers. They rarely seem to even have units deployed on walls in order to fight back against units that were climbing those walls via siege towers or ladders, giving the attackers, in this case me, very unnecessary advantages that just kind of felt meh. This also could lead to a prominent issue that the AI would just have its entire army sitting behind the gate that I was going to attack, which would cause the AI to just mob anything that came through the gate with everything it had. This led to a pretty easy exploit that I don't want to exploit, but like, what are you going to do? Where because the AI would blob its entire army onto people coming through the gates, you could just use a vortex spell or a bombardment ability to just obliterate the defenders. I cannot tell you how many sieges I won in my campaign with Lord Skrulk by just breaking down the gate, walking in some units to be mobbed by the defenders, and then I'd overcast Plague 2 or 3 times to just insta-kill everything. The AI needs to utilize the walls appropriately. When it's attacking them, it should maybe attack 1 to 3 entrances and sections of the wall at once, depending on the amount of units available, instead of like it was in the Proving Ground beta, where it seemed to try and attack every single section on the walls, or at least every gate simultaneously, even if it didn't really have the capability to do so effectively. It should be trying to do more of like, I think, a hammer blow approach as opposed to like a bunch of daggers aimed at every possible way to get in, because it's just not a good strategy. And the biggest thing I think the AI needs to learn is how to send in units as needed, whether it's defending or attacking, instead of just sending everything in at once, which causes these massive titanic blobs that are just way too easy to exploit. Whew. All right. I think that brings us to the end of this video. I'd really love to hear all of your thoughts on your experience with the Proving Grounds Siege beta. Did you like it? Hate it? Especially when it comes to ladders and gates. I would like to once again take this opportunity to really thank WorldAnvil so much for sponsoring this video. I have been pretty damn picky when it comes to sponsors over the years, as I never wanted to advertise something to y'all that I didn't think would be worthwhile or trustworthy. So to have this opportunity is quite welcome, and I really implore you to click the links below and check them out. It would do a lot for this community to have a strong showing on this, and to thank WorldAnvil for putting their trust and financial support behind what we do here. Don't forget the promo code SOTEK, S-O-T-E-K, at checkout. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all again real soon. Bye.